Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Breda Pest Management. Brief pause before we begin here today because we do a little show before the show, and if you watch the show on demand, you don't see that part of it, at least usually anyway, I don't believe. But we do a little show before the show just to kind of warm up and kind of get going. One of the things we were talking about a moment ago are people who listen to the show and the value I put in my own work because of the hardworking people who choose to listen to it. Really means a lot to me. And we're talking about some armed services personnel, soon to be retired that are kind of checking us out. Also this from K-Shad, and I love this, to give you an idea of the kind of people that I'm very proud to have a part of our show. So K-Shad, check in on YouTube, and we're going to start the show after this, I promise. He says, I'm currently listening while building Christmas bikes for retail stores. Your show keeps me motivated. Let me tell you something right there. That's the kind of work I love because I love Christmas. I love the happiness of, going down there and finding out that Santa Claus, brought you a bike or, stuff like that. And obviously the hardworking folks at the stores who, kind of have that stuff ready for people too. Nothing better than a great toy on Christmas, and frankly, nothing better than a bike on Christmas. And K-Shad, one of the guys out there helping Santa Claus get some of that stuff ready to go. That is a really, really cool thing, man. So K-Shad and guys like that, thank you so much for being a part of our show here today. Now, let me give you an idea of what's coming up here today. We're busy getting ready for Georgia, Florida. That means Davin Bellamy on the program. That's going to be amazing. We're actually going to have a little bit of a blast from the past with Davin to go back and celebrate a great moment from the recent past in the Georgia-Florida rivalry. We'll have some fun with that. Mike Griffith stops by today, too. Also to kick things off. Oh, yeah, and one of the things that we'll do, too, is there's a really weird rumor out there involving Nick Saban right now. It's probably not true, but it's somewhat interesting, so we'll touch on that for a couple of minutes. Because this is one of those cases where the conversation is interesting, not necessarily the actual facts on the ground. But anyway, we'll touch on that. But to kick things off, I have detected, perhaps you've noticed this too, a little bit of a change in Kirby Smart. Not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, just something that's different than it used to be before. What does that mean going into Saturday's game against Florida? That's where we're going to start here right now. I'll give you the evidence and allow you to decide for yourself because we trust you to make those decisions. So all of that is coming up. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA Athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So I've sort of noticed something that I feel is a little bit of a difference in Kirby Smart, the way that he is now, the way that he talks in some respects, compared to what he would have said years ago. And I'm going to point this out for you. I'm going to let you decide for yourself. Now, I want you to understand something. This, for me, isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something worth noticing. And sometimes in life, that's all you do. You just notice it. And today, I'm going to throw this out there. I'm going to let you notice it as a way of continuing the buildup for Georgia and Florida coming up on Saturday. Do you remember one of the great catchphrases? That was always kind of the cool, thing when Smart first became the Georgia coach. There were these like little catchphrases that everybody sort of grabbed hold of, jumped on, and it became really a part of like the lexicon. So much so that you had politicians using some of this kind of stuff. It just sort of escaped the boundaries of just Georgia football alone. And one of those catchphrases that Smart became very famous for, especially in his second year at Georgia, 2017, is one of those things that you still see some remnants of today, probably not as much as you once did. That's kind of the point of this conversation. But there was a phrase way back in Smart's second year of 2017, the first big breakout year for him as the Georgia coach, that it seemed like he said over and over and over again. You may already know what I'm talking about here, but if not, our Jay Black has put a little compilation here of a phrase that really kind of defined, especially on offense, the philosophy for Kirby Smart when he first started being the Georgia coach. Do you know what phrase I'm talking about? Take a listen to this.
Keep chopping, man. We got to keep chopping. They never stopped chopping wood. Chopping wood, man. They just kept chopping.
I mean, do you remember that? And by the way, great job by Jay Black kind of putting that compilation together. The funny thing is, and now this is a quick aside, we'll get back to it. A lot has changed in the Georgia media landscape over the course of, this is our 10th year doing DawgNation Daily. You go back to like 2015, 2016, 2017, those first years of us doing the show, we weren't archiving a bunch of video back then. There just wasn't as much of that. YouTube wasn't, believe it or not, quite as big then as it is now. Now, anything anybody says lives on the internet forever. Some of that stuff is a little harder to find than perhaps it would have been. But Jay does a good job of going back through the annals of history there, pulling out a lot of examples of Kirby Smart chopping wood, keep chopping wood. Do you remember the era of Georgia chopping wood? Do you remember that? You still see this when Georgia does the one of its pregame videos. I think it's the one that leads into Baba O'Reilly. There's a little bit of a montage at the beginning of that where Kirby also says, "You keep chopping wood." You know, that's still a part of like the game day pregame video stuff for Georgia. So that's a phrase. It was a very big deal back then, has lived on for a long time. Now, if you were around back during that era, you know what that meant. What that meant was, and Smart was very open to explaining this at the time, what that meant was, hey, when it comes to running the football in the SEC against really tough defensive lines, really stout SEC defenses, that's not always going to be easy. And the way in which the difficulty of that might show up is it may be really tough sledding at the beginning of the game. You may try a running play, and it may not work. Even if you got like the Nick Chubbs and the Sony Michels, which Georgia had back then, DeAndre Swift too, even if you've got these great running backs, you may try running plays at the beginning of the game, and that defense is fresh, and those bodies are big, and those players are mean, and they're just not going to give up any kind of rushing yards for you at the beginning of the game. But Smart's philosophy was, you don't quit. That's what keep chopping's all about. Trying to chop down a tree, that first big axe blow, that may not do anything. But you keep hitting it over and over and over again. Finally, you make a dent. Then you make a little bit of a bigger gash. And then eventually you're able to topple that tree because you keep chopping over and over and over. And that was the Georgia offensive philosophy. Now, to be fair, not everybody loved that. If we're really being honest here, even when Georgia had great running backs, there was a thought process out there of, you know, maybe this is a little more conservative than it should be in the, you know, kind of a world in college football at the time where passing offenses were all the rage, and some teams were like, you know, throwing it a million times a game, scoring 50 points, playing much faster. Georgia back then was keeping on chopping, keep chopping wood, keep chopping wood. It wasn't everyone's favorite offensive philosophy, but it was the kind of thing that Kirby Smart was very, very invested in way back then. Now, once again, not necessarily a good thing or not necessarily a bad thing, just something worth noticing. It certainly seems like this year, the whole notion of, man, we're going to keep chopping wood. We're going to stay committed to running the football, even if it's tough at the beginning of the game, and even if it's tough for stretches during a game, we're going to keep that chopping wood mentality. Can't help but notice that some of the stuff that Kirby Smart says now around Georgia football, not quite as committed to chopping wood, perhaps, as he would have been in the past. Maybe for good reasons, but it's just different. Last night, an example of that. Kirby Smart was asked at the end of his media availability, how you feel about this Georgia running game here right now? He has, by the way, been asked a version of that question now several weeks in a row for reasons that are probably self-evident. But how you feeling about the Georgia running game, right now? Well, Kirby Smart talked a good bit about that. The one phrase that he did not use at any point in time in that discussion was the idea that we're going to keep chopping wood. That's not exactly the way Kirby Smart speaks about running the football right now. This is what he said last night.
Well, it depends on who I'm playing. So I'll tell you about the first quarter, how I feel about the run game. Because it's everybody wants to, it's like the pass game. It's relative to who you're going against, and it's relative to how they're playing you. And, not everybody's played us the same, and not everybody has the same X's and O's up there. Like we don't really change our run game to game, right? We have different window dressings. Nobody does. You can't put new runs in, so you don't invent runs. You take the runs you've worked on all year round and you say, okay, how do these work against these fronts? And in some cases, they've worked really well. We've had a different lineup at two positions and really kind of a merry-go-round of guys playing up there. So there hasn't been great continuity. I don't think that's really affected us. I think it's been, Trevor getting used to being in there, getting Nate warm, had Branson, lost Branson, had Jared, lost Jared, had Tate, lost Tate, and it's just, it's been a bunch of different people. But I'm very confident in our run game and our ability to run the ball because people have to honor our ability to throw the ball. And that's one of the things we do well, so they complement each other.
Watching on YouTube here for a moment, Scott Pete says, fans whine when Georgia doesn't throw it. Then they whine when they are throwing it too much. Because I like the idea of keeping hitting the line and wearing them out. And I think that Scott is, to a degree, right about that, is that, look, there's always going to be some sort of criticism of offensive play calling. That is just sports talk 101. I mean, about going back to the 90s when it was just radio, to the 21st century when it's radio, TV, internet, YouTube, podcast, everything else. The easiest thing in the world when it comes to the Monday morning quarterbacking of football is to sort of criticize play calling. That's 100% true. It's one of the reasons why we've been trying to be clear in this topic of what we're pointing out right now is not necessarily good or bad. Some of that's in the eye of the beholder. It's just a notice of how different it is. For instance, did you hear Kirby Smart in that that conversation we just played for you saying that one of the reasons why he's confident in Georgia's ability to run it is because of the respect that teams have to have for our ability to throw it. That's way different than the Georgia of the past, and not necessarily wrong from an offensive philosophical standpoint based on my understanding of football, but it certainly sounds like right there that Kirby Smart says, hey, we throw it now to set up the run, which is about as diametrically opposed from the old keep chopping wood days as you could possibly get. It's just, I would say, an example of a real, whether you want to call it an evolution or a change or whatever, Kirby talking about the running game now different than he would have been in the past. And let me add something else to this, because couldn't help but notice something else in Kirby Smart's language this week, also going back to last night, in talking about DJ Lagway, the very good quarterback for Florida, a guy that Georgia's going to be really ready for. We're going to talk a lot this week about how you get ready for Lagway and, kind of what you do to make sure you got your best defensive performance ready to go for him, especially in light that the last game Georgia played was so good defensively. In talking about Lagway last night, Kirby Smart used a very interesting word that you typically would not use for one of Georgia's opponents. You typically would use this about Georgia, at least for a good number of years. This is the way in which Georgia would be talked about. Kirby would talk about his own team. But now Kirby is seemingly using a description for another team that sounds a little bit like what he would say about his own team. Let me let you hear Kirby talking about Lagway last night. See if you notice the word that almost sounds kind of Georgia-like that Kirby used to describe the Florida offense right now, Saturday's opponent. This is Kirby Smart.
Well, a lot stands out. He's got great size. He's got great arm strength. He's got really good pocket mobility. He's got a great offense around him. They do a good job. They run the ball, and they set up shots off of their run. And when you're stubborn about running it, then you open yourself up to a lot of play-action shots. And he throws a great deep ball. He has been very consistent with that, and he seems mature beyond his years, because it'd be different if this was his first game, but he's played quite a bit this year. He's played really well.
So isn't that interesting? In light of our conversation about the old school Kirby was keep chopping wood. And now it's, well, let me see who I'm playing. Let me judge this in the first quarter, and then we'll see about how many running plays we're going to call after that. So I would say a pretty dramatic shift offensively in terms of how Kirby Smart talks about all of this. Did you hear the word that Kirby just used to describe the Florida offense? Now, put the DJ Lagway part of this aside. We'll obviously get to that here this week, a major topic. But he says in the midst of what they do with Lagway, they're also setting up these shot plays because they run the ball. And the word that Smart just used there, I couldn't help but notice this. Florida is, as he says, stubborn in the run game. You could almost make the case that Florida's the one on Saturday that's going to be trying to chop wood, staying committed to the run as a way of building the passing game off of that, whereas based on Smart's own words from a moment ago, that Georgia's opportunity to run the ball will be based on how successful they are throwing it. Now, some of that evolution has been a change for the better for UGA. Part of the reason they won championships in both 2021 and 2022 was Georgia became better at throwing it. And during that period of time, Georgia was better at throwing the ball than they were at running the ball. That was a hallmark of those national championship offenses. And yet, here in 2024, as Georgia's probably trying to figure some things out offensively in a way they weren't back during those championship seasons, it is at least a stark reminder of how things have changed that it's a team like Florida that's going to be the stubborn team committed to the run no matter what on Saturday, while Georgia's going to be judging the flow of the game, at least based on Smart's words, to see how much they can run it. The stats sort of back that up here for a moment. One of the things that can be interesting in the running game is how successful you are at so-called semi-explosive runs. Let's just judge running plays of 10 or more yards. Florida's got 36 of those on the season. Georgia has only 27. Florida is not one of, like, the better rushing teams in the SEC, to be honest, but they have been more successful running it than Georgia has. Rushing yards per game, Florida averaging almost 150 rushing yards per game, like 149 point whatever. Georgia averaging about 130 yards per game. So Florida almost 20 yards per game better on the ground than Georgia has been. Go back to the last time Florida played, what I thought was a fairly surprising win for the Gators against Kentucky. You know, Montrell Johnson, their starter, their leading rusher, was not playing. They put a backup in his place. He had 100 yards rushing that day. So Florida has shown some commitment to, as Smart said, to stay stubborn with the run. And Georgia this year has not done that. Now, if we all were sitting around the lunch table together or the tailgate together or the outdoor, fire pit together, and we were all having this conversation of, well, how come Georgia isn't running it more and how come Georgia isn't running it better? We would maybe get a lot of answers that would perhaps suffice as to why. There have been some running back injuries. Smart just talked about that. There have maybe been some issues with the offensive line. That's perhaps fair to bring up. Is Georgia blocking with its wide receivers on the outside for the kind of toss sweep type plays as well as they used to have been? Perhaps they are not. Is the quality of the Georgia running back right now what it would have been in the best seasons for the Dogs on the ground? Different people may have different opinions. Your mileage may vary on that. The point is there may be a lot of viable answers as to why Georgia doesn't run it like they once did, but the actual, I think, indisputable fact is that Georgia is not as committed to the run as it once was, because I think that Georgia's confidence in its ability to rack up big rushing yards is probably certainly nowhere near as high as it's been in the past. So to kind of wrap all of this up and put a bow on this going into Saturday, I think it's probably important to remind ourselves that in private, Smart is probably not as casual about all of this as he sounded in the clip we played of his evaluation of the Georgia running game from last night. I think deep down, Smart knows for this team to be everything that it has a chance to be this year, being a little better on the ground is probably a prerequisite. And think about a stretch of that game against Texas where I think a lot of folks were hoping after early success for Trevor Etienne, Georgia going away from the running game at that point. I think that Georgia privately would like to have enough confidence to stay with the run in some of those situations, to keep a high-powered offense off the field, to control some clock, to maintain the kind of pace that you want, especially with like Ole Miss and Tennessee looming in future weeks. So this Saturday in Jacksonville could be a great time to get that going. There's a long history in the Georgia-Florida game of the team who rushes it better winning the game. This goes back to when I was a child. It seems like we were talking about that. We're probably still talking about that here now. And establishing the run on the way to beating Florida, I think sets you up for even more success against Ole Miss and Tennessee. That's not to say that we don't want Georgia to throw it. Quarterback play is probably as important in college football as it's ever been. But giving a complementary offensive punch to go along with that potentially potent passing attack, probably a pretty important thing for Georgia. And this Saturday against the lousy, stinking Gators would be a great time for this rushing attack to break out in a way that perhaps it has not all season long. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. We're happy that you're with us here today, no matter how you get to us. Live on video, 10 a.m. across all platforms, radio, Athens Sports Radio 96 The Rev, podcast, wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. Man, we're just so happy that you're here, and glad to have our friends at Breda Pest Management a part of the show today, too. They're big sports fans. They love the dogs. Our buddy Matt Breda especially does. And you better believe they're excited about the cocktail party coming up on Saturday. There is no doubt about that. Everybody's getting ready for it. And, of course, as you're getting ready to travel and go down to Jacksonville, many of you are down there at the Golden Isles or somewhere like that, getting ready to stay and have a good time, you want to be able to do that with the peace of mind of knowing that while you're gone, termites aren't invading your home, flying squirrels, whatever. They're not getting in your attic. Believe it or not, that's a thing. You want to make sure that your home is sort of well treated and protected against all that kind of stuff. That's where our friends at Breda Pest Management come in. Bugs, critters, termites, things like that. They protect your home for all of that. And when you make the switch to Breda Pest Management, they're going to put more money back in your pocket just for making that decision. It's one of those times in which everybody's going to try to find some way to save money where you can. Your pest control service, your termite protection is a great way to do that. So please find them online, BredaPest.com. That's BREDA, BredaPest.com. Find them online here today and trust them for your termite protection, your pest control. You get the prestige of saying you work with the same company that UGA chooses to work with, the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. But in addition to that, you also are going to put more money back in your pocket for making the switch. That fly-by-night company, their quality of service is going down, their cost of service is going up. When you choose to work with Breda Pest Management and send that other company packing, when you choose to work with Breda Pest Management, you're going to have a great, great experience and put more money back in your pocket just for making that choice. So online, it's BredaPest.com, BREDA, BredaPest.com for more on that. All right, very busy for us today. It is Davin Bellamy, the great former Dog, coming up in a moment. That's going to be fun. There's like a really weird Nick Saban rumor out there that in a roundabout way sort of, I guess, kind of bumps into Georgia. We'll give you some details on that. It's probably not true, but it's at least interesting. So we'll touch on that for a moment here, just to let you know what's being said out there in the college football world right now. I'll also get you ready for what's, a pretty intriguing weekend here coming up around the sport. We'll get ready for all of that. But prior to that, let's go around the doghouse, presented today by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. And I want to give you a brief update on what has been a long-standing conversation that you got to imagine is due very soon to kind of come to a close. So DawgNation had some reporting yesterday on the future of the Georgia-Florida game in Jacksonville. And look, we try to be, I think, fairly open about our own opinions around here. If I have a bias about something, I try to make you aware of that. And I'm certainly not one to try to conceal anything like that. Obviously, I'm a Georgia fan. You know that already. But I'm talking about within the bubble of DawgNation, we have biases. We have sort of micro biases, even within the major, kind of bias of sort of a pro-Georgia point of view. And one of my biases, I'm very much in favor of the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. I think it's a really cool tradition. I've always enjoyed it. It's something that I've certainly hoped would survive for a long time. At one point in time, I was kind of skeptical that it would be able to, but it was always my preference that the cocktail party would thrive. However, we're also, kind of, open to other opinions too. And I've always respected the opinion of what seemed like a growing number of Georgia fans that had some very good reasons for why they wanted to see Georgia-Florida become a home and home. Not least of which the fact that seemed to be Kirby Smart's preference for a while, but also because, there was a desire to have better home schedules and, better opportunities, SEC games at night, the chance to play Florida and Athens at night, this type of thing that's not going to happen in Jacksonville because of its cocktail party tradition, that there was just a growing argument that maybe we should play this game in Athens every other year and then travel to Gainesville for that. That's been a lingering debate that has had a lot of passion on both sides. I think it's fair to point out that debate is probably over. And I don't believe you'll ever hear, for instance, Kirby Smart ever mention this again. He has, even on the SEC network during SEC Media Days a couple of years ago, kind of talked about his desire to see it become a home and home. There was a fun debate back and forth between he and Tim Tebow about that. I don't believe we'll see that from Smart ever again. I think we're likely to get an announcement here very soon that not only is Georgia and Florida staying in Jacksonville for the long haul, but even during the 2-year hiatus when it's the stadium in Jacksonville is going to undergo a massive renovation, it certainly sounds like Georgia and Florida will also be played in kind of one-off neutral sites during that period of time, too. In fact, let me read this to you from DawgNation. Connor Riley writing this yesterday, that the mayor of Jacksonville, Donna Deegan, noted in a Tuesday press conference that both Georgia and Florida have made serious strides in negotiations in recent months. And she teases the announcement that the future of the Georgia-Florida series there in Jacksonville could be, announced here, as she says, quote, very soon. She says, we'd love to have an announcement this week. We're pushing to try to wrap things up. Don't know if that will happen. This coming from the Florida Times-Union, the newspaper based out of Jacksonville. And as Connor points out, the NFL recently approved a stadium renovation in Jacksonville that's going to limit the seating in 2026 and render the current stadium unusable for the 2027 season. the current Georgia-Florida contract runs through 2025. So next year is the end of the current deal. You got 2 years worth of renovations coming up after that. And I believe for as soon as like the 2028 season, we're going to hear this thing is staying in Jacksonville for the long haul. And if you're watching on video, you get an idea of what this stadium renovation is going to look like. It's going to be dramatically different, with the retractable roof type situation here where you're essentially, be looking at possibility of, I guess, playing this game indoors, which is so strange to think about after all the years of, what the game has been, but probably where all of this is heading. And even, those two, odd years where the renovations taking place in 26 and 27. A lot of fans remember the 1994, 1995 season where you played home in Gainesville, or I should say on the road in Gainesville in 1994, home in Athens in 1995, 2 bad years for UGA, but that's what you did back then. Some folks thought, well, you might do kind of a sort of a 2-year separate home and home here, but I think the truth is, based on some previous reporting that's gone on over the course of the last year or so, the cost of traveling for a road game is so expensive, teams kind of require the budget windfall this money provides. They're just probably looking to get some money from somebody, but whether it be Tampa or Orlando or Atlanta or wherever else during that 2-year period, because these teams have come to be pretty dependent on this extra money that comes in. And that's sort of like the overall, I think, bottom line to this is. We said this the other day when Georgia Tech announced that it was selling its home game against Georgia to the Mercedes-Benz Stadium for 2025. You're going to make, $10 million in the process? We are in a day and age now because of the House settlement, if you followed that story, the back payments that could be owed to former student athletes because of the legal wranglings here and the upcoming revenue sharing that's about to begin where players are going to get paid money from the regular athletic budget, most of that coming from TV money, that dollars are about to be more at a premium in college athletics than they've ever been before. And if you've got a chance to make some money somehow, you're going to do it. And so, therefore, the budgetary requirements of a game like this for Georgia are just too big to ever give it back to a home and home and lose that extra money. And all of a sudden, that becomes a pretty valuable commodity here. So, interesting update on that yesterday. Could be hearing an announcement here pretty soon about, maybe where this game is going in 2026 and 2027, but certainly starting in 2028 for the long haul after that, the Georgia-Florida game remaining in Jacksonville to the delight of some, to the chagrin of others, but happening perhaps nonetheless. And that is Around the Doghouse here today, presented by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. Now, a lot of folks down there in that part of the, kind of the south part of our state, south corner of our state, southeast corner of our state, have been greatly impacted by Hurricane Helene. Normally, they'd be getting ready for a lot of fun with Georgia, Florida. That's a big game for a lot of people in that part of the state. But right now, some of those folks are still going through a very serious cleanup. And some of that obviously relates to the agricultural community here, too. That's one of the reasons why our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau, who've always been so supportive of Georgia's farmers and so committed to keeping great tasting, freshly grown food from Georgia's farmers on all of our plates here. That's one of the reasons why they've stepped up in such a big way here right now. You've heard me talk about this before, the tremendous financial loss coming to our agricultural industry because of these terrible storms. The pecan industry, that's a 9-figure sum of money. Poultry, between $520 million of lost revenue coming to our poultry folks. The forestry section of Georgia here, about 8.9 million acres of Georgia's forest land have been now destroyed. That's a loss of more than $1 billion. You could say the same thing about cotton and peanuts, the dairy sector. So much of that just devastated after the impact of Hurricane Helene. It's one of the reasons why Georgia Farm Bureau is teaming up right now with the Georgia Department of Agriculture to partner and help raise money and kind of recoup some of the loss here. All kinds of agricultural organizations getting involved in this. Of course, our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau will be leading the way. So we want you to go to supportgeorgiafarmers.org for more on this. It's supportgeorgiafarmers.org for more on this. 100% of the funds raised are going to go directly to Georgia's farmers. And this money will give us a chance to keep eating that great tasting, freshly grown food right here in Georgia and avoid the need to go out and export our food and things like that. We're going to keep Georgia farmers in business. We're going to keep our food tasting great on our plates. Our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau always supporting our agricultural community, and they're going to do that here right now. So go to supportgeorgiafarmers.org for more on that. All right, we got a lot to do today. It's Davin Bellamy later on. It's a look at some of the other big games of the weekend, too. But for now, on everything with Georgia, getting ready for the lousy, stinking Gators, let's talk to Mike Griffith here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let us say hello to Mike Griffith here, DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. Getting ready for the cocktail party on Saturday. Always appreciate Mike's time. Mike, there's a topic getting ready for Saturday that, it's been kind of an interesting thing. Kirby's been pretty coy about this. Do you give much, credence to the idea that the targeting call against Dan Jackson, targeting call against Janelle Aguero, those calls could be overturned and perhaps Jackson and Aguero could be available for Georgia on Saturday? There has been some reporting on this. Kirby has not said much about that. I guess I haven't really taken it all that seriously. Is there a chance that this ends up being an opportunity for Georgia to get a couple of defensive backs back? What do you expect on that?
Yeah, that'd be pretty fascinating. So I had the opportunity to catch up with Steve Shaw. We were able to get a one-on-one with him through our DawgNation connections. And the way those appeals work, Brandon, they're turned into the league office the following Monday, which has been last Monday. And Steve Shaw actually reviews those calls that same day. So if those players were to be eligible, Kirby Smart would have known that on Monday, and Florida would have been alerted that those players would be eligible. It would seem to me we would have heard something. Now, I could be wrong. You never say never. But as Steve Shaw described the rule, and by the way, Kirby Smart is on the rules committee, so he knows the rule as good as anyone. He's been in those discussions. There hasn't been a lot of emphasis on offensive player targeting, and that's what's been talked about a lot as well. The ball carrier lowered his head, and therefore Dan just mirrored that. Well, the difference is the defender is in the attack position. The offensive player clearly does not want to be tackled and is merely trying to get extra yardage or protect themselves. So by the letter of the law, they were both targeting calls. I think Cody Chaffins did some really good still shots on those. And you can see in both cases, the Georgia players did have their helmets all the way down. The button right here, 6-inch radius. If you lead with that, that's targeting. The way you avoid it is keep your head up when you tackle. And this is the way these coaches teach it. Now, maybe the rule needs to be reviewed or changed, but as things stand, by the letter of the law, those were attack. Another thing Shaw told me I thought was very interesting, it doesn't matter what the intent is. I think I go back to the Lewis Seen hit on Kyle Pitts, and we said, my goodness, Kyle Pitts lowered himself and Seen couldn't have done. It doesn't matter what the intent is. What matters is the actual action. Did the crown of the helmet hit the neck or head area? Did the player drop his helmet? By the letter of the law, they did. Maybe Kirby is an advocate for the rule to be changed, but as things stand, both of those hits qualified as targeting. Shaw also gave me a pretty good stat. There have been some targeting calls overturned at a fairly high rate, but that's typically in the non-televised games, which means those calls did not go under video review. In the case of the Georgia-Texas game, obviously there was video review. They used that on a pass interference call, a story for another day we already told a few times. But the fact that it has already gone under review, that is typically the appeal, the original appeal. So when a coach sends a play in like that from a televised game, it is actually a second appeal, kind of a backup appeal. And only 3 out of 21 times at the FBS ranks had those calls been overturned going into last week.
What's funny about this is that Ohio State, a lot of folks saw the game against Nebraska on Saturday, very high-profile moment late in that game. They had a player who was flagged for targeting in that game, obviously would have been suspended for the first half against Penn State. You mentioned some targeting is being overturned. He did get his targeting call overturned by the Big Ten. Now he's eligible for the first half against Penn State. So that is at least one high-profile example of a game that a lot of people were watching because it was a highly ranked team like Ohio State, fighting for its life late in the fourth quarter. That was a targeting call that was overturned.
Well, and here's why it's key for Georgia. Brandon, and you know this. I'm sure you may not have this in your notes, but we all know that Georgia's dominated the first half of the last 3 games against Florida. You go back to 2021. I'm looking at my notes here. 24-0 in 2021, 28-3 in 2022, 26-7 in 2023. Now, the last team to beat Georgia, not named Alabama, was Florida in 2020, and I think we remember the second quarter of that game. I want to say maybe Kyle Trask might have thrown 3 or 4 touchdowns in one quarter in that, the wheel route, right? They're still trying to figure out how to cover it. Remember, Richie LeCount was out that game, and Jordan Davis was too. I digress. If you don't have starters Dan Jackson and Janelle Aguero, and you've just lost 3 guys that were drafted in the top 100 picks of the NFL, Georgia, even with all their talent and depth, could be challenged against a quarterback like DJ Lagway, who is very accomplished at the deep ball. Even more so if the Gators were to get a bit of a ground game going, which Kirby covered. Obviously, that would give them some run-pass conflict and provide some balance that Texas was not able to get against Georgia that very much they needed. Any team really needs that, I think. So the fact that if these 2 players aren't playing in the first half of this game, that is a potential game changer.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Also, we got an update from Kirby yesterday, once again on some of the injury situation for UGA. Where do things stand with a guy like Tate Ratledge, who at one point in time this Florida game would have been circled for him? Jordan Hall sounds like he's certainly fighting hard to get back. And Mikael Williams, some of that stuff still lingers with him. Where do things stand for Georgia on the injury front ahead of this game on Saturday?
Yeah, it sounds like they really want Tate to play, but Kirby did mention managing his snaps. Now, if Tate starts, keep this in mind, that would be the 4th different offensive line combination for Georgia in 8 games. So, we've kind of come down on Carson a little bit. His numbers aren't as prolific maybe as in the past. Well, he lost his, 2 starting X receivers to suspensions. Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers are off starring in the NFL. And I want to say Arian Smith might have had 20 catches combined in his first 3 years, and he's your current passing yardage leader or pass catching yardage leader. So Carson's supporting cast, not the best case scenario. Offensive line has not been as congruent as past years. To your point on Tate Ratledge, I think anytime you get a guy like Tate on the field, it's a big boost. But the fact that Kirby mentioned managing his snaps was interesting to me. Do you start him and maybe see how it goes? Jordan Big Baby Hall, this is a guy that I had high hopes for, a former 5-star in his 3rd year. Certainly looked like he was ready to come into fruition. The miracles of modern day medicine. This guy had, broken legs essentially. And we're talking about him playing in a football game. I don't know what's a realistic hope, but another big body in there, even if he only plays 4 or 6 snaps, that's big. One of the keys that Georgia's had in these dominant years where they ranked number 1 and number 2 in run defense for a stretch of 5 years. Last year down to 18th, not sure where they're at now. I think most recently I saw them somewhere in 30s or 40s, was because of that dominant defensive line play. And it had been missing. Michael obviously brought a big boost. I did think it very interesting when I posed the question to Kirby Smart about Michael being back to full health against Texas. And Kirby said, no, he's still not 100%. We think this week he's going to be even better. Now, I don't know if that's hyperbole or just trying to scare the bejesus out of Billy Napier. But if that wasn't Michael at 100% against Texas, holy cow, we could be in for a big treat. And how important is that when you've got 2 pass rushers like Jalen Walker and Michael to use in tandem, bring them from a lot of different angles. Steve Sarkisian spoke at length about that, how Michael was able to chase the quarterback out of the pocket, and they had Jalen as a spy. And with his closing speed, he was able to clean up with 3 sacks. That's going to be a handful for the Gators to protect against it. If Michael is even healthier, that's great news for Georgia. Now, we'll say this, Lagway is much better in the pocket than you would expect a freshman to be. Kirby talked about how a lot of times these young quarterbacks are easily flushed and don't show the poise and the patience. That's not an issue for Lagway. Lagway is a guy that can step up. They like this guy a lot. Not only the big arm and the quote-unquote wow throws, as Kirby calls it, but the poise and the leadership, and perhaps most importantly, Brandon, the confidence and belief that his teammates have in him.
Sorry about that. I lost my sorry about that, Mike. I lost my earphones there just for a second. I was waiting to watch your mouth stop moving, so I know when to talk again. Then we put some stuff on the screen there. I apologize for that. Let me squeeze in one more thing before we let you go here, and that is simply this. Talked about Kirby Smart a moment ago, and kind of how some things have sort of changed philosophically for him. Maybe not quite chopping wood with the running game as much anymore. I think some of this is just sort of the natural evolution of football, perhaps. But I also think maybe privately, Kirby not quite as casual behind the scenes about what has been a pretty ineffective Georgia rushing attack as perhaps he's projecting publicly right now, that I think that deep down he knows they got to be a little better in the running game than they've been thus far this year. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think a lot of it, he addressed that. And I think a lot of that had to do with how teams are defending Georgia. And let's call the elephant in the room. If there's not an elite receiver why wouldn't you challenge Carson to go downfield more? Why wouldn't you stack the box and make the Georgia Bulldogs show you that they can effectively throw the ball downfield before you back off a little bit? Now, Arian Smith has great speed, but I don't think he is a Lad McConkey type figure. I think Todd Monken once referred to him as a situational player. And I think Arian's worked very hard to be a 3-down receiver. But right now, that's your scariest receiver. I love it. He gives you what he's got. He's a tough kid. He did short arm a ball against Texas. I know that was kind of disappointing. But this receiving core, if we're just going to be completely honest, I don't know, Brandon, you followed Georgia for a long time. I think it's lacking, and that's why Lawson Lucky's emergence is so important. He looks very good catching the ball. Oscar Delp, of course, was there on the flea flicker. This is a guy that Georgia had big hopes for. And ETN, I'll say this on the ETN front. I was a bit surprised to learn this. While he does have 20 catches, his longest gain is only 14 yards. And something's wrong there because this is a home run hitting guy. Now, Kirby also makes it a point to say they're not practicing to win one game. They're practicing to win all of them. And I do think there is some player management going on here. I don't think you can lean on ETN with 25 touches a game and expect him to be 100% for the playoffs in December. So you need answers, right? You need to have London Humphreys emerge. You need to have Anthony Evans emerge. You need to have some of these younger guys that maybe you weren't counting on to be key figures in the receiving game. You need them to get better. And I think the bye week was really valuable for Georgia in this sense. I'll be really curious to see if they can find some new weapons. And oh, by the way, let's not forget the running game. And part of the reason why it's hampered, Roderick Robinson is a guy that I really, really thought was going to have a big year. And I know his numbers from the G-Day game weren't sexy, but you saw him move the pile just like I did. And I think 4th and 1 with Roderick Robinson's a pretty good bet. Etienne's a very good back, but at the end of the day, he's 195 pounds. Whereas Rod Robinson was doing it at 235. Branson Robinson also out with an injury. So you've been deeply affected by the loss of 2 of your preeminent power runners. Cash Jones has done a very nice job, a bit role for a walk-on. I think he's squeezed a lot of talent and been very clutch and very key. And I think we all are excited about Frazier. But much like many other freshman backs that have spent the majority of their life running the ball because they're so doggone good, not as much time pass blocking. And that is the issue with getting Frazier out there more, is you must protect Carson Beck. This is a guy that you absolutely cannot lose. And so when you put Frazier in there, it's a pretty good tip that he's probably going to run the ball. They're not going to put him in a protection situation, or at least they haven't to this point. Maybe at some point he turns the corner. Maybe the bye week is just what he needed to be ready to be a 3-down back. But I think some of it has to do with the personnel in the backfield and the lack thereof. And I think some of it has to do with the lack of elite pass receivers and how teams are defending Georgia right now at the line of scrimmage.
Mike, great stuff. Appreciate your time as always. We look forward to reading a lot more from you at DawgNation.com, back here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management again very soon, too.
Appreciate it, B.A.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, I lost my earphone volume at one point in time during that with Mike. We have to change the batteries in that every now and then. Could not be less convenient. But nonetheless, we soldier on. Good stuff with Mike Griffith there. Davin Bellamy, great former Dog here, coming up in a moment. Prior to that, let's go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and getting ready for a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation and our DawgNation cruise coming up in April of 2025. Of course, many of you know that's going to be on board Utopia of the Seas. And I tell you, man, the exciting stuff to do on board Utopia of the Seas, can't ever get tired of talking about all of that. Specialty restaurants, special neighborhoods. You know, one of the cool things about Utopia of the Seas, obviously the tradition is the great main dining room, and I've always loved that. I kind of like the old classic cruise experience. I always loved the main dining room. And that comes at, no additional charge. A great meal as a part of your regular cruise fare. But you also have these really cool specialty restaurants you can enjoy too. Playmaker Sports Bar and Grill is a sports bar that's got so much to offer. The wings, the nachos, the beer, of course, watching all the games. You've got the Mason Jar, Southern-themed restaurant with the bourbon cocktails and the Southern food and the country music band that plays in there. Giovanni's Table, the Italian restaurant. There's so many cool things for you to enjoy when it comes to Royal Caribbean. Jessica Slater, a great travel agent, can tell you all the more about that. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her at jslater@dreamvacations.com. So as I told you, we're going to get Davin Bellamy here in a moment, but couple of cruise around the SEC stories before we get there. I thought it was really interesting. There's been a rumor out there, and as I said before in the show, this is probably not true, but I'm going to speak about this anyway because I think it's indicative of what the next few years are going to look like, that Nick Saban, prominent presence on TV, ESPN's College Game Day, retired, but still young and healthy enough that he's always going to be a looming figure out there for any kind of perhaps easy button for a program to hit. There's been a lot of chatter amongst West Virginia fans. They're very dissatisfied with their coach, Neil Brown. He was in the hot seat a year ago, held on to his job, perhaps a little bit of a surprise team in 2023. But now West Virginia fans are ready for a change. And as many of you know, a famous graduate of West Virginia is Nick Saban. So there's been this thought of, well, maybe Nick Saban will come in here and he'll be our coach. Well, another West Virginia grad, Pat McAfee on ESPN, on his show this week was actually talking about this. This has risen to the level that even McAfee was talking about it, the august body of journalism that show is. McAfee was speaking about the idea of Saban coming back to Morgantown. He says that it's probably not true, but he did acknowledge another thing that's also kind of been out there in the rumor mill right now, which is that Saban, because of his love for his alma mater, could maybe get involved in like helping with the coaching search or getting involved there. And this is where the rumor mill sort of, I guess, briefly sort of bumps into Georgia here, because if Saban does have some influence over that next coach, then obviously those with a Saban tie would be kind of thought to be in that conversation, which perhaps gets you to Glenn Schumann. You know, Neil Brown's not even fired yet, so this is not an open coaching job. But it is worth noting, early rumor mill for that job, you know, would have perhaps Glenn Schumann maybe being involved in that. I have no idea if it's going in this direction, but I do think it's interesting that, you know, much like it's always been kind of Urban Meyer, John Gruden, things like that. There's always the ex-coach out there who's ready to kind of come in the eyes of some fans, swoop in and save the program. You're going to be hearing a lot of that about Saban in future years, probably for as long as he is in as seemingly good health as he is right now. Maybe some affection for his alma mater. Could he help them find a coach? If he does, could Glenn Schumann be a part of that? It's at least worth considering that as a possibility. So a lot of you are aware of the situation in the NFL involving Anthony Richardson, the former Florida quarterback. Kind of an embarrassing situation for him. It should have been taking himself out of the game because he was supposedly tired. Well, now he's been benched. And so there's this thing out there of, oh, well, the NFL has a problem with its quarterbacks here right now. There's a guy named Sam Block who wrote this. The tweet got a lot of attention, 7 million views for this, 107,000 likes. So this clearly is the kind of thing that's been a part of the football conversation. Block writes, you've got Anthony Richardson benched at the age of 22, Bryce Young benched, Trey Lance benched, Justin Fields benched, Will Levis benched, Zach Wilson benched, Mac Jones benched, Kenny Pickett benched. He says the NFL's got a quarterback development problem. And then some people point this at the college coaches of, these college coaches are running these easy offenses, these like one-read offenses, and so therefore they're not preparing the quarterbacks for the NFL. Well, a couple of things about this. For whatever reason, this makes my blood boil. It just absolutely does. First of all, the colleges are already marketing the players for free. Are they supposed to also develop them for free too? In other words, is it really the college's fault if the NFL is not developing its own quarterbacks? And in the case of guys like Anthony Richardson and Will Levis, we tried to tell y'all they weren't good. These guys that weren't good in college are somehow magically going to be good in the NFL. Daniel Jones, I put him in the same category for the most part. And then you got guys like Zach Wilson and Mac Jones who were essentially only good during a pandemic year. We tried to tell you that year didn't count. So most of us, Trey Lance is on this list. Trey Lance wasn't all that good in college. He played that one showcase game during the pandemic year. He wasn't even good in that game. But somehow he's supposed to be the next big thing at quarterback. You know, Bryce Young, I would have thought would have been pretty good. Maybe he still could be. But the point is, most of these guys on this list, you can't blame college for these quarterbacks struggling in the NFL when most of us would have told you these guys weren't that good at the college level, at least for a long period of time. But that's been a hot topic here this week. I was going to talk some more about these upcoming games for this weekend. I don't want to keep our guests waiting. Let me instead save that for a different time. We got a big one, though, between Penn State and Ohio State outside the SEC. Obviously, some interesting games for positioning in the SEC. We'll get to more of that tomorrow. For now, we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And let me get ready to say hello to Davin Bellamy here. Great former Dog. Always so much insight into everything happening with Georgia football here right now. And Davin, I mentioned to our audience earlier, I wanted to go back and, by the way, he got his Yankees hat on. If you're watching a video, you see that. Yankees stay alive in the World Series last night. They extend that. So showing a little love to the Yankees there, Davin.
I am, man. Really, I'm a Braves fan, but we didn't make it that far this year, so I got to rock out with the Yankees. Hopefully, Aaron Judge, bat can get hot this week.
That's right.
Tonight.
Yeah, been a little quiet. Judge has been during the playoffs here thus far. You can't help but notice that. So I told our audience before the show began, one of the things I wanted to do with you today, because this is such a great memory for me. I don't know if you remember it as fondly as I do, but I certainly loved it. Think back to your big win against Florida back in 2017. That at the time was breaking for Georgia. Another one of those lingering losing streaks against the lousy, stinking Gators. We hate those stretches where Georgia didn't win this series. But to see your team go down there and get that win in 2017, to see the Florida crowd running for their lives, Georgia fans taking over their half of the stadium, the Florida fans running for the river, man, that was so much fun for me. How much fun was that for you to kind of bring Georgia kind of back into an era of success in this rivalry, which still lasts here right now? How much fun was that for you to experience?
Man, that was so much fun. I don't think people really understand that when we decided to come back, it literally was a revenge tour. It was no smiling in the off season. It was I told you, I went to the whiteboard in the weight room and just wrote down all the SEC teams we had to play in. So we fast forward to the Florida game. I mean, we're just checking off the box right now. Man, we're like a hitman that's been given a list, and we just checking off the box with no emotion. So we was going into that game already riding a high just from the season of how well we've been playing, and we had the confidence. We fully expected to do what we did. And honestly, I think until we put our second strings in, they didn't cross the 50-yard line.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, we just had a total domination focus on that. So having the fans leave early was definitely a part of the plan.
Yeah, I mean, to me, so much of what Georgia enjoys now was kind of built on the foundation of that year. And like you said, that revenge tour, that willingness to say before the season began, we're checking off this one and we're checking off this one. And to have games like that happen in such an emphatic fashion, I don't think there's any doubt the confidence of the fan base grew because of that. The players, even players that weren't at Georgia yet, I think they inherited a level of confidence when they put the Georgia uniform on, because you and Lorenzo and Roquan and obviously Sony and Nick, Jake Fromm, you all raised the level of what I think that Georgia expected to be. A game like that, I think, was so instrumental in kind of laying the foundation for what Georgia would become.
Right. And I mean, even when it comes to the recruiting, aspect of it, our year was the year that, I guess you want to call the celebrities started being on the sideline, as, the Quavos and, the rappers and just people from the outside world. Well, that comes from winning. And this is what Coach Smart always told us, he said, on the outside looking in before I got here, you look at this team and Georgia has so much talent, but it's so many guys trying to get recognition by themselves. Coach Smart told us, if you just win, everyone wants to be a part of winning, and watch how everyone gets the notoriety that they're trying to get. And I think you saw that. And then when the recruits that came in after us, I mean, they kind of caught that wave of the emotional support of just how much Georgia is getting, and they wanted to be a part of that. So, I mean, at the end of the day, kind of like Coach Smart has always said, winning cures everything, and winning will give you all the notoriety you want, even if you don't have the stats.
Do you like playing this game in Jacksonville? That's always a hot topic, and it certainly seems like the game is going to stay in Jacksonville for the long haul, other than a couple of years' worth of renovations here coming up. As someone who, had great moments in this stadium, also enjoyed playing between the hedges, if you had your choice, where would you want this game to be played?
You know what? To be honest with you, man, I did not enjoy playing in Jacksonville simply because, one, it's 50-50, so you don't get that home field advantage, and it doesn't get as loud as, a home or an away game will get, because while the office is on the road, the stadium is split 50-50. And then you start to talk about just the field and the locker room. When you start to look at how the SEC facilities and stadiums are built versus the NFL, it's night and day. So playing on the Jacksonville field, it was kind of a downgrade from not playing in Sanford or sometimes playing on the road because just college football puts more money into their facilities. And definitely as a player, you enjoy that. You always enjoy, playing at home, but also you enjoy that battleman's mentality on the road. And I've always wanted to play in the swamp with my back against the wall and just experience how loud it gets there. In my opinion, I think it should be done how we do Georgia Tech, where 1 year's there, 1 year's here. And I just think you will get more of the fan bases involved because, like I say, it's a 50-50 split. So that game never really gets that loud.
I think that's really interesting. We talk about DJ Lagway, and we'll talk about him. Really exceptional talent for Florida at the quarterback position. Guys like this, the big arm, but can also do it with their legs. We just know in this day and age how difficult they are to defend. We also saw Georgia have a lot of success defensively in its last game against Texas, albeit probably a different kind of quarterback, at least when Ewers was in the game, than kind of what Lagway is. What do you think the game plan looks like for limiting DJ, young, inexperienced quarterback, but just like, loads and loads of talent? What does Georgia do defensively against DJ this upcoming Saturday, you think?
In my formal opinion, I definitely think, when you look at him, he's an athlete, and it's either a big play or scrambling around to make a big play. You never see him really nickel and dime down the field. He's always throwing a deep ball, a little post route. It's never like a 5-yard hitch or a dig route. You never see those routes just to move the sticks. So in my opinion, you kind of take that same game plan that you had against Alabama, not the one that we did because, Jalen Milroe ran crazy. Yeah, I'm not afraid of two as the athlete, but more so of what I said, on our show is creating a cage, not giving him escape lanes, and also taking away the explosive plays and making him take the underneath, making him take the check downs. But I definitely think as of last week, you saw Georgia was able to mix up the packages and show mug fronts with guys lined up in the A, B, C gaps, just full and just disguising. And it even confused Ewers, who's a older guy. I think if we come into the game with disguises in our, coverages and take away the big plays and make him nickel and dime us, down the field, in my opinion, I don't think he can do that. And he'll throw us some interception because he is, turnover prone.
Boy, I love that. I'd love to see Georgia kind of get in there and rattle the cage with him a little bit and force mistakes. Right. That would certainly make a win a lot easier to come by on Saturday. Fun to think about that. Let me finish with this. It's amazing to me that, we talked about this before the season began, and here we are kind of about to be in the midst of it, the stretch that Georgia's about to go through. I know Georgia's a fairly sizable favorite on Saturday. I treat this Florida game for Georgia as probably pretty tough. This is a game that you got to be, at your best to have your best shot of winning. Then on the road at Ole Miss after that, coming home for Tennessee, which, I think from an atmosphere and hype standpoint, this game for Georgia may almost be as big as the one back in 2022 was. That Georgia really is kind of in the midst of a stretch of schedule the way that it was kind of projected to be before the season began. How ready do you think Georgia is for all of this? A little bit different than schedules kind of used to be where you play a big game, maybe you have a couple of games in which at least a team like Georgia, had probably a little bit of a break, way better than the competition. But boy, it certainly looks like Georgia's about to be in a fight for its life for like the next 3 weeks at least here. How ready do you think Georgia is for all of that?
This reminds me of when we was playing Bama in the national championship, and at halftime, Coach Smart said, "Why is everyone so happy? That team knows how to win. That team has championship DNA. They're not even wavered right now." And I think, we fast forward, 6, 7 years later, that's what Georgia has become. Everyone on that roster is used to playing in big games. Everyone on that roster at one point in time is used to being the number one team in the country and the pressure that comes along with that. So I definitely think, Georgia has the experience and also just knowing how to win that other teams don't have. There are some players on the Ole Miss roster that have never played in a championship game, and as far as Tennessee with their young, quarterback. And I definitely think the games before, struggling in Kentucky, losing in Alabama has prepared, Georgia for the long stretch. So just the coaching staff and just the experience and knowing how to win, that's also a skill. Knowing how to win is a skill that everyone doesn't have. And I think Georgia has that through the winning and championship DNA and the equity, that we have. We're prepared for the long run.
Boy, Davin, that's a fun thing to think about. I'm looking forward to getting back to talking to you about a big game on Saturday for our DawgNation postgame show. Can't wait for that. I know you'll also be a part of our pregame coverage, too. Your insight always so valuable on game days. Also, thank you for being with us on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management here today. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll catch up on Saturday, and we're hopefully talking about a big win against Florida and a big stretch of games that come up after that. Davin, thanks for your time.
I'll see you after the win, baby. Go Dogs.
Love it. Go Dogs, indeed. Good stuff from Davin Bellamy. Let me also make a quick point about something, too. So when it comes to the game in Jacksonville, you heard Davin kind of say his piece there that he'd like to play home and home. He thinks that's kind of what it's all about, and that's what's fun. If I am right, and I believe that I probably am, about this game's future kind of remaining in Jacksonville for the long haul, I do think it's going to be interesting to see how that looks in what seems to be kind of growing momentum for the 9-game SEC conference schedule. It seems like we're heading in that direction. And, I was asking, I actually reached out to Connor Riley about this because he follows the NFL a lot more closely than I do. When the NFL went to a 17-game schedule, all of a sudden now you no longer have the same number of home games and road games that, some teams are going to get one extra home game per year in some years, and I guess you have to reverse the other year. You've also got the international games there where there's really, to hear Connor say it, no sort of hard and fast rule about, how you balance the home games and the away games, and how the international game sort of factors into that. My reason for bringing that up is because I think you're about to see a version of that with the SEC as well. Like right now, you've got 3 conference games that are played neutral. Georgia, Florida, and Jacksonville. Arkansas, Texas A&M have played at Jerry World, and obviously Oklahoma and Texas have been there at the Cotton Bowl State Fair. Well, I think the Arkansas A&M game is about to go away. They're about to start playing that home and home again. But the Cotton Bowl is going to be there in Dallas for the long haul for Texas and Oklahoma. It looks like Jacksonville for the long haul for Georgia, Florida. It could be interesting if this does go to a 9-game conference schedule. Do they treat those neutral site games as sort of the one-off, and each team gets 4 home, 4 away conference games each year? Or does this kind of get counted as a home game, counted as an away game, and in some years you've got only 3 home conference games, you have to play 5 on the road, with that neutral site game kind of counting as one of those? That could be interesting to see. Obviously, it'd be great for all 4 of those teams to avoid having to have the imbalance of road conference games. But you also kind of imagine some SEC teams might complain about that a bit. So that's maybe the next big argument for us to get into here is if the SEC does go to a 9-game conference schedule, if these neutral site games do remain, I believe they will, how this gets handled within the balance of, who you play at home, who you play on the road with an odd number of conference games. That's kind of a long-range discussion within the next couple of years. That could be one of the next things that we are arguing about. Now, when it comes to arguing, there is no arguing about our friends from Laster Tractor. Everybody knows what Laster Tractor is all about. Really just taking care of folks when it comes to those John Deere tractors. And when you need something like that, you need our friends at Laster Tractor. They're the hometown John Deere dealer right there in South Georgia, and they've been that since 1956. So if you've got some acreage, maybe up to 5 acres, you might want one of those Series 1 tractors. If you've got some a little bit larger than that, 10 to 15 acres, you might want the John Deere Series True. This is for people who are like, truly doing like farm and livestock and stuff like that. If you've got even more acreage than that, well, you might want one of the bigger Series 3 tractors. And in addition to all of that, when it comes to those great compact utility tractors, you can also get the attachments you need too, whether it be the loader bucket, the rotary cutter, so much more. You can reach out to our friends at Laster Tractor, your local dealer for your next compact utility tractor. You can also find them online. It's LasterEQ.com. Laster is LASSETER. LassiterEQ.com for more on that. Get yourself a great John Deere tractor from South Georgia's hometown leader in these wonderful tractors for all of your home agricultural and just lawn tending needs. Our friends at Laster Tractor got you covered on all that. LasterEQ.com for more on that today. Make sure to check out Before the Hedges, presented by Kroger tonight, UGA Recruiting Talk, with a little bit of a Halloween flair to it tonight. I won't say much more than that. I won't spoil the surprise, but good stuff coming up on that tonight. No surprise here. Lousy, stinking Gators continue to be the subject of our golden shoes. We've got a couple of great ones to give out for you here today. How about Scott Burton, who writes in to say, my little guy is ready to sick the Gators. Good-looking dog there, chewing on that Gator toy. I'm talking about just ripping it to shreds, which is what you love, and that's what the dog's going to be doing on Saturday, too. He gives you a hashtag DawgNation Daily, hashtag Gator Hater, hashtag Dogs on Top, hashtag Golden Shoe. Scott Burton, well-earned for you indeed. And then not to be outdone by that, another Golden Shoe going out to a Leroy Eugene Grover, who writes in to say, how about Dogs on Top, baby? You see the Gator there on the cooking board there, getting ready to be sliced up and grilled up and, I guess kind of put on the spit and just all the way grilled out. That's pretty good stuff there from Leroy. We will give him a golden shoe for that, too. That Gator ready to go. And then how about 1,453 days? That's how long it's been since the lousy, stinking Gators beating the Georgia Bulldogs. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then. And our video time now for the R.S. Andrews cool down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised and the price that's promised. That is how they take care of all of you, and they'll do that for you here today. Brodo Baggins says, that's me. Is that really you with the Gator? Are you really cooking the Gator? Like the whole deal there? I've seen it done before. Oh, that's awesome. Jack Fullerton says Gator for dinner. We love that. Andrew Hughes says, and on video. We love that. MG says, lag way, going to be lagging way in the backfield for a sack. Boy, I like that. Good breakdown from Davin Bellamy on how to stop him. By the way, also interesting stuff. Davin just sort of drops this into the conversation. What Kirby Smart said at halftime and that national championship game at 2017, for instance. So that stuff's really interesting. You get a lot of that, for sure. Well, let's see what else. Jack Fullerton says they say the Gator tastes like chicken. Kind of does. A little, I would say pretty plump, especially the tail. Gator tail pretty plump. Kind of light, maybe almost airy. But good. But good indeed. Let's see what else. Let's go on the subject of kind of comparing Georgia and Kentucky. He says the Swamp's what swallowed Kentucky. Florida won't be as lucky in Jacksonville. I think that's probably true. I do expect Georgia to win this game. And they may win it with some margin. I do believe it's probably a challenge, though. If I had to say. Let's see what else. Yeah, Brodo Baggins says that Gator's being seasoned as we speak. Brodo, that's awesome. Good for you, man. That's good stuff. Let me go to Facebook for a moment because I did not hit them earlier in the show. Let us see what else. Yeah, sorry about the brief hiccup with the headset during the Mike interview. That was on me. I was watching Mike, waiting for his lips to stop. And then that's going to be my cue to start talking again, and that's going to switch my batteries out. But not to be done. Not to be done today. All right. Ken Holcomb says blackened gator tail is delicious. I can imagine that is true. I've had fried before. Matt Rugavina says he could see Georgia winning but not covering, maybe something like 27-13, still a double-digit type win. I could see that. Mary Clark, though, says dogs are on the way. Gators, get ready for your usual loss because the dogs are on the way. I like that. Rick Joyner checking in. Rick, I'm glad you're here. What else? Kent Dagestani says, I'm watching my boy B.A. on the road from Atlanta to Walton, Kentucky, making my drive easier. Well, Kent, thank you so much for being a part. Really, really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Michael Castleberry says, I'm glad to hear there's some attention being made on Texas's schedule and pushing for my transparency on decisions. I promise as a 30-year Texas resident that the Texas fan base is both entitled and obtuse, which is a great way to say that. Yeah, so I definitely believe that it was, and I don't like to use the word bad look. I've told you before, I'm not into PR all that much. But when the other day, when it was Texas who got the benefit of the unorthodox officiating decision to go back and correct a call after the ball had already been placed, after the eruption of the fans, after obviously watching it on replay, that definitely brought back to mind what a lot of folks thought was an excessively easy schedule for Texas. And we had the thing yesterday about what Matt Hayes wrote at USA Today of behind the scenes, SEC officials are openly complaining about this. So I do believe that Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, has a little bit of a, it's going to come across more harsh than I want it to be, a not quite crisis, but word that means something similar to crisis. It's at least a situation where, I think he's got a lot of unhappy people in his league right now. The SEC has always been a league that's kind of moved unanimously in whatever direction. But when it comes to, like I just talked about, the 8-game and the 9-game conference schedule, they can't get agreement on that at all. Because here's the thing, I'm going to make a small point about something outside of sports. Then we'll bring it back to sports. You know why we have so much political division in America? Like, part of the reason we have so much political division is because we're a country of 330 million people or whatever it is. And if you look at the continental landmass of the United States, it's just gigantic. Gigantic landmass, huge population. It's really hard to get a lot of agreement from, really different people living in such a giant, landform. Just really hard to do. So to bring this back to sports, as the SEC gets bigger in terms of the number of teams and as the geographic expanse of the league gets wider, like, your days of getting unanimous agreement on topics is probably just over. You've got very big and wealthy schools. You've got schools who are frankly just lucky to be in the SEC. You've got this weird one-off Vanderbilt that's sort of only in there because the university presidents like the idea of rubbing elbows with some fancy pants academic types. Like, you've got all these factions and mini factions within the SEC. And the days of getting a lot of agreement with those, factions is probably just over. And so that goes back to the issue with Texas, where a lot of people, you would imagine, everybody's looking at everybody's schedule. Wow, look, just sort of magically, Texas got this, really easy schedule. At certain point, I do believe Sankey's going to have responsibility to demonstrate that Texas will be treated in this league like anybody else is, because that's not the way it was in the Big 12. The SEC has never really been that way. Even people say, well, Alabama gets special treatment this, special treatment that. I don't know how much I've ever actually really bought into that. The SEC has always been a league that, for the most part, I believe, treated its members as somewhat equal, even though, clearly some programs have more value than others. They weren't always treated that way necessarily. But that's not what Texas has been used to. So is the SEC going to bend to Texas's will, or is the SEC going to be what the SEC has typically been? Greg Sankey's got to be a strong leader during all of this, and we'll report on what we see from him. Greg Childers, going back to baseball, which Davin brought up, says the Braves aren't doing anything in the offseason. They can't. They're on contracts in nearly every position. They aren't paying big money for a shortstop or starting pitching. That's the downside of signing players to long-term deals. You're kind of stuck with them, literally banking on the future. Yeah, I do think it's going to be interesting, what Atlanta does here. Obviously a different kind of offseason, but if you're Atlanta, you can also, if you want to play the other side of that coin, you can sell better next year just on the basis of being healthier. A lot of the Atlanta issues this year, I do think, were a byproduct of how banged up and injured they were. And some of the young pitchers, have looked pretty good. Julian Harris says the Georgia haters are praying our offense and defense doesn't play well at the same time. They're envious the college football fans would be in full meltdown. I think you're right. Obviously, if Georgia does put it all together, then Georgia will be as dominant as it's ever been. But obviously no guarantee you can get everything kind of moving in the same direction for the same game. Going back to Texas, by the way, Doug Rayburn writes in to say A&M fans warned us this would be a problem. And it's true. We said this on the show. I heard from a lot of A&M fans post-Texas, and they all had kind of some version of the same joke of, how do you like me now? Do you believe me now about what Texas is? And we did. We gave them an open apology on the show that A&M fans tried to warn us about this, tried to prevent Texas from getting into the SEC, and to a degree, they look right. Andrew Hughes asking about updates on the Pay Cody situation after the.
I'm Cody Chafin's in the control room. Yeah, I'm all for this. I actually was coming on to tell you something else, but I'm listening.
Yeah. So any update, Cody, on getting the proper retribution? Now, if it was a dog bite, we could get our friends at Zagoria Law to get involved for you. I don't know if they handle broken camera situations, but any update on getting proper retribution from Texas?
Yeah, well, Merriweather and Tharp not going to be helpful either, but we do know lawyers. No, I haven't heard anything. The camera is fixed, and, I haven't heard anything from anybody, but did hear from some Texas people online that they were disappointed, and that's fair enough. Just Texas fans, I should say.
Yeah.
Brett McMurphy releasing Action Network reporting that the 2-year break for the Georgia-Florida game. He wrote it incorrectly on Twitter. Going to go to MBS in 26, Tampa in 27, then coming back to Jacksonville in 28.
So that's official report. That's not
That's what he is reporting.
Yeah.
Sources told him.
So what's interesting about that is this goes back to what Mark Richt sort of always called for of, hey, maybe you should play the game in Atlanta, every now and then to kind of make up for some of the travel balance that Coach Richt had a problem with. I also think that Georgia's travel for the game back then a little bit more arduous than what Georgia does now in the Kirby Smart era where they fly directly out of Athens. But so there you go. Official reporting from Brett McMurphy, longtime, plugged-in guy for college football. Atlanta for 26, Tampa for 27. I was sort of hoping the game would go to Orlando. I like Orlando. My family, we go to Orlando a pretty good bit. I was sort of hoping the game would go to Orlando. I think that'd be fun. But instead, it's Tampa and Atlanta, at least according to Brett McMurphy here. So we'll count that as at least an official report, not necessarily a confirmed news, but an official report nonetheless. So good stuff from Brett McMurphy there, and good stuff for Cody Chavin's breaking in with that. Keith Ritchie says the SEC wants to prop up another team besides us since Bama's done. Look for Texas to be given another shot any way that it can. Yeah, I mean, listen, I get Georgia fans having a little bit of a bad attitude about some of this kind of stuff. I think you're well within your right to do that. We said this yesterday about the Lane Kiffin thing. Like Kiffin, and y'all know, especially if you're part of this part of the show, you're really, kind of plugged into our sort of typical conversations. A lot of y'all know I'm not a huge fan of Lane Kiffin, but Kiffin showed you the way yesterday. Man, you got to fight over every square inch right now. Complain about your game times, complain about your schedule. You have got to treat this as the adversarial world in which it is, because right now I don't trust. I mean, my level of trust for college football's key decision makers has never been as low as it is right now. Garrison Tucker checking in from Hawaii. He says, got to beat those lousy, stinking Gators. So in Hawaii right now, is it 10, 9, 8, 7, 6? Is it 6, 8? Or is it 5:18? Is it 5:18 in the morning in Hawaii right now? Either way, Garrison, I'm happy to have you here, man. That's awesome. Alan Hampton says he did not like his gator meat. He said it was best used for feeding the dogs. So perhaps that's indicative of what's going to happen on Saturday. Lesko says, are we wearing home or away on Saturday? That is a great question. From year to year, I can never remember. I do kind of, there has been times before when both teams wore their dark colored jerseys, blue and red. I sort of think they should do that every year. I kind of like that. I would be in favor of doing that every year. Especially since their main look for their home uniforms is so sharp in contrast anyway. I'd be in favor of full color, full tilt for Georgia, Florida every single year. Spencer Clark says, if Bama lose to LSU, I don't think you can count them out of the playoff because they beat us while being ranked at number 1. I mean, obviously that Georgia win for Alabama is going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting. And at a certain point in time, like I almost did this today, but I don't quite have my research done on this. So I have a little bit of here's how sometimes I kind of come up with stuff for the show. I have a little bit of a theory about something, and I want to judge it to see how true it is. I started doing some of this yesterday. I just didn't get finished with it. So my theory is this, that people have a tendency to believe that we're about to have a whole bunch of teams at 6-2 or a handful of teams at 7-1 in the SEC, that we're going to have a log jam of teams with very, very similar records. History, I believe, would suggest that's not quite true. I started doing some of this yesterday, that it's a lot harder to go, for instance, 7-1 in the SEC than you think. So the teams that are 7-1 right now, or at least have a chance at 7-1 in league play, Georgia, Texas, Texas A&M could still be undefeated in league play. That the basic thing that I'm building on is that this potential log jam of the 6-2s and the 7-1s, one or the other of those two outcomes, is probably not going to be as likely as some people seem to think it is based on recent results in the SEC. I'm not quite ready for that one yet, but that's kind of what I'm getting to. Garrison Tucker says it's 5:19 in the morning, but he can't miss the show. Garrison, that's awesome. Man, I tell you, that is so nice of you. I appreciate that so much. Thank you so much. Love the chance to talk to you about some Georgia, Florida here. We appreciate you being a part of the show. Curious to know what island you're on right now. I'd love to hear that. Oh, fair point. Jay Black pointing out that when Georgia lost to Florida in 2015, the Fatone Bata game, and I hate to drag Fatone's name through the mud, but it is what the game is known as. That was full color on full color, home on home. All right, so they have the red jerseys out there, so that is the case. Like, I like uniforms. I'm into that kind of thing, but you'd be surprised at just how little memory I have from year to year of like national championship games and Georgia, Florida, all these sort of neutral site type deals about which uniforms Georgia did wear, has worn. It seems like for a lot of these best Georgia games, I'm right in saying this, that Georgia seems to end up wearing the white jerseys for a lot of these, right? That's Bama 21. That was not, though. They wore red jerseys for TCU 22, right? I think they wore white jerseys for the 2017 SEC championship. A lot of these big Georgia wins seem to come in white jerseys, it seems like. Let's see what else. Foster Moss wondering what happened with Missouri. They literally fell off the face of the earth. Yeah, I mean, really a different team on defense. They also had some injuries. So, Brady Cook was obviously banged up, tried to give it a go on Saturday, but I didn't even realize this. Like Theo Weiss, their really good wide receiver, he didn't play at all against Bama on Saturday. Now, Theo Weiss not making up 34 points, but this is a team that has dealt with some injuries in light of everything else. Like UGA Marine throwing it back to grumpy old men, which is very funny. Savannah Bryan says UGA is the home team this year, so thank you for that, Brian. Appreciate that. Senior Dog 54 can't read that comment. Savannah Bryan says that Jacksonville now pays Georgia to travel to and from Athens just to keep the game. Yeah, I mean, like the one thing about Kirby Smart is, and this is one of those deals where, like, I wish somebody smart would do, I mean, even like a book. I'd probably read a book on this, but at the very least, a good article. Is that Kirby's got a pretty good business sense about him. In addition to being, he's not just like a meathead football coach. He's got a little bit of a business sense about him. It certainly seems like Georgia has a much better deal negotiated with Georgia, Florida for that game now than it did in the past. I think that's the case. Savannah Bryant says, not looking ahead, but FanDuel's got Georgia as a 10.5-point favorite against Tennessee right now. That's an interesting spread. All right, very quickly, a couple of final comments here. Michael Castleberry says the whole, Texas SEC love feels intentional. Texas fans want to be atop the SEC mountain without having to do anything. With the SEC brand are truly earning it now they're here. Yeah, I mean, we talked about that a couple weeks ago. There was this headline, and the headline's not Texas' fault, but this idea of Texas having immediate success in the SEC. And our point was, well, hold on now. They've beaten Mississippi State and Oklahoma, and that's what they'd done at the time. Oklahoma is just as new to the SEC as Texas is, and Mississippi State's far from, a typical example of a typical SEC team. That there was, I think, an attempt to crown Texas pretty quick. And, I try to have a nuanced conversation about this because I do truly believe that Texas has improved as a program. Like if this was the Texas of a couple of years ago, well, they'd just be getting dragged up and down the field. But they've gotten better with their lines of scrimmage. Sarkisian has, I would say, made this program a little bit more like the typical SEC team. So from that standpoint, I'm not, some hater that's never going to give them credit for anything. I mean, I thought what Texas did in 2023, the Big 12 refs last year were out to get them. And they still, made the playoffs. So I'll give Texas some credit for 2023, and I don't have a problem doing that. But as, Michael points out, and if you live in the Lone Star State, you are definitely you're going to be very, very attuned to all of this. There is an attempt to sort of make them into something before they got it. Philip Jordan Wells says, my shirt is fly today. That's awesome. I'm happy to know that. I'm happy to know that. That's good to hear. I appreciate that. Yeah, there you go. There you go. By the way, Cody Chafin's put together a great video for Georgia, Florida. I won't spoil too much of it, but it kind of goes back and look at some of the cool moments on the show over the years. And I've really loved it because a lot of this stuff is like great memories for me. But it's also amazing just how much my weight changes over the course of years. Go back to like when we first started the show in 2015, 2016, I was still decent shape. I got to be pretty heavy. I've always battled my weight. It's just one of those things. I always have. Always probably will. Just one of those deals. Like 2017, 2018, around that time into 2019, boy, that's pretty heavy for a while. Got better in 2019. Then pandemic was a total disaster. And it's been somewhat under control for most of the time since then. But, you go back and see these videos. It's just crazy to think about how true that was. You forget, right? But crazy to think that. Philip Wells, thanks for the kind words. I appreciate it. He says, never apologize for a great-looking outfit. I appreciate that. UJ Marine on DawgNation.com says it's NIL and not Sarkisian that's made taxes. I would agree with that. Obviously a willingness to spend money. But I do think that Sarkisian, and by the way, this was a guy, put his personal stuff aside, even just on-field coaching, not a great success at Washington, not a great success at USC, really did kind of reinvent himself during his time with Nick Saban. I do think you got to give him credit for that. I really do. And so now, not only is his reputation restored because of his time with Saban, I think he, by appearances, learned a lot from that period of time too. So, like, I'm more than happy to go through all of the, are we sure Texas is not getting preferential treatment topics? I'm happy to do all of that with you. I'm here for all of those. But I do have to give Sark a little credit for the job that he's doing because, let me ask yourself, take Kirby out of this for a moment. How many coaches out there right now are doing a better job than Sarkisian is? I would say that Oregon's quietly starting to play better. We got some questions about Dan Lanning, and I thought to begin the season, Oregon was a little shaky. Now, I've always been very clear that I believe that Lanning's one of the top up-and-coming coaches in college football. But to begin this season, we sort of wondered about Oregon a little bit and doubted them going into the game against Ohio State. We'll own that. So now Lanning has got his team playing really well. So it's a Lanning, it's a Sarkisian. This is the collection of sort of like that sort of next group of coaches, I think. All right, we got to get ready to go here. Anything else? Cassie Turner says, we beat the spread one time this year. She goes, I'm not worried about the spread. I just want to win. Well, I understand that for sure. Andrew Hughes says, how bad do we have to beat Sunbelt Billy for him to get fired on Monday? Yeah, obviously we've seen that before, Georgia essentially ended the career for Jim McElwain, essentially ended the career for Dan Mullen with victories in this series. Right now, it sort of seems like they'd like to try to find a way to keep Napier if they can. For sure. All right. Keith Ritchie says, ever notice how many of our hated teams wearing the same ugly colors? Yeah, you can't help but notice that. And I guess you'll now add the burnt orange of Texas and all of this too. another orange team for us to dislike. All right, y'all have a great day. Check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They'll show up on time. They'll do the work that's promised, the price is promised. You can trust them on all of that. Hope all of you have a great day. Get your air conditioning tuned up. Get your water heater replaced. Get your heating system ready for the winter. Eventually, you got to imagine it's going to be here. Get all of that. Foster Moss also pointing out that his prediction was wrong, that Sunbelt Billy did make it to the cocktail party. Yeah, I mean, listen, rumors of his demise perhaps exaggerated, to use the old line. Maybe that's the case. Either way, we'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then.